Please welcome Mr. Daniel Libeskind.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be in your beautiful city. And particularly today, I had the chance to visit the Stockholm Palace. And I thought, what an incredible masterpiece that really brought together so many issues of not only 20th century, but also what is to come both into the future and what looks backwards. And that's what I would like to actually speak to you today about. I would like to speak about what I believe is very important, is that architecture really is a language of communication. Of course, it's about science, infrastructure, technology, but to me, primarily, architecture is a means of telling a story. It is linking something of the past, of the future. It's a discipline that is really part of the liberal arts. In fact, many thinkers thought that architecture is the mother of the arts, of the liberal arts. And what are the liberal arts? They are geometry, they're music, there's philosophy, poetry, dance. That's really the meaning of architecture. And of course, it is supported by scientific research and technology. But primarily, to me, it is a discipline of culture. It is a discipline which is so central to bringing people together with its universal language. And I would like to share with you some words that I jotted down, which are important to me personally when I design a building or a plan. Hand. You know, we live in an era of incredible simulation, era which has incredible machinery, virtual reality, amplified reality, incredible computing powers that we, of course, have. But to me, the hand continues to be not only the emblem, but the reality of what architecture stands for. Because, of course, the hand has to do with drawing. And I've always believed what really the masters of architecture in the older times believed, that architecture really is about two things. As Vitruvius, that great Roman theorist who copied the Greek test, said architects should know only two things primarily. They should know how to draw, and they should also know music. And luckily for me, I was also a musician before I really entered the field of architecture. And I love to draw, and I really believe that buildings really come out of drawings. Buildings come out of drawings. Drawing is a means of really rethinking and reassigning the role of architecture in not only in space, but in time. I'm sorry you cannot see these drawings. They're really blown up. The drawings are only about this big. But there are a series of drawings, and I created many drawings before I built a single building. Really, for many, many years, I kept on drawing. I didn't have any clients, so I didn't draw fantasy buildings, but I drew what I thought was important in architecture. And of course, drawing continues to be the way I evolve a building. Of course, it's a means to connect the brain, the hand, the eye, and also the tactile quality which a drawing always represents. And of course, every building comes out of somewhere. It doesn't come out of just a computer program, doesn't come out of the rationality of technology, but comes out, to me, from the hand. And that is a very important element in my work. The word energy, and I'm here because I have I was lucky to win a competition for my first building here in Belgium, in Mons. And I thought really about energy. Energy today is usually associated with just energy, the physical energy, electricity, sustainability, energy that goes into buildings, energy that buildings emit, carbon, and so on. But there is another kind of energy really, which is an energy of transforming a city by a building. And here in Mons, I had the opportunity to work in really the new master plan, which really is a very ambitious new plan with Calatrava's station, with a new really set of buildings that creates a new area that extends the area of Mons, and of course is very, very important in terms of its communicative role in the center of the city. And I thought the building for a large convention center, the Congress Center, should really be a building that takes that energy and connects in form, in space, and in function new needs, which of course Mons will have. And of course, the question here is, you have a program which is so complex, because you have the forum, you have restaurants, you have event spaces, you have large exhibition spaces, you have many auditoriums and halls. It's really a machinery to bring so many people together. But how do you create a building that really raises the awareness of the history of Mons, that really allows one to see the building from the historical center, but also points to the historical center, and a building that, despite its great size, has a human scale? And of course, that's the ambition of a building like a Congress Center, because how do you bring natural light? How do you create an atmosphere which is full of life, full of interest, an atmosphere which can inspire people to do the kind of things that convention centers really should do? And of course, that means creating interesting places, and the entire sort of dynamic spiral ribbon, which is how the building is conceived, which brings the park and the river back to the center and vice versa. This ribbon also shapes all the spaces. It's not just the facade of the building, it's a wooden cladding, but emerges as a metallic cladding on top, and of course shapes even the black box spaces of the building itself, and the building of course raises itself to reveal its activity. So again, the energy of a building is, to me, one of the key really emblems of what a building is, and the energy in really a more global sense that's simply the consumption and emission of energy. Now, the word spirit has certainly been discredited in the 20th century. It's almost an embarrassing word to use in architecture, because what does it mean? We have no God, we have no belief, we have no faith in such things. But I think the spiritual element is of key importance in developing any building, to me. And what does that mean? Well, that means that when you deal with forgotten histories, when you deal with erasure of history, with genocide, how do you bring through that void, through the vacuum of history, through the abyss of history, something that connects us once again with a hope? Because it is useless to reflect on irreversible tragedies. And of course, these tragedies are irreversible. No one will come back. So when I had a chance really to design my very first building, which was the Jewish Museum in Berlin, I thought about, how do you make a building that isn't just based on the soil of Berlin, just on where it stands, but it's based on the real Berliners. Not just as famous as Albert Einstein, who I incorporated, or Arnold Schoenberg, or E.T. Hoffmann, or Rachel Varnhagen, but really the invisible soil in which the light of Berlin is placed. And of course, that's a building whose emblematic quality, whose spaces are part of communicating a difficult story, a story that is abysmal, but at the same time a story of a city coming back to life. And to do that, of course, the spirit has to cut through, sometimes through kind of darkness, through a very sharp light that pierces the heart and pierces the soul and cuts into our awareness of the fact that cities and buildings have this memory, and that memory is an important aspect. It's not just a footnote to a Jewish museum or to another museum, but it is really the orienting area of architecture itself, in my view, because without memory, we could not really be oriented in any space. Memory is the key factor, and of course, in that sense, the way light pierces a building, the way the wounds and the trajectories of invisible space penetrate, that's really part of the spirit of a building. And I think every building really carries that spirit. And whether it is the Garden of Exile with its reversed vegetation, whether it's the building itself, which doesn't really have windows, but a kind of invisible topography of Berlin, whether it's the Holocaust Tower, which is not really even an exhibition space, I think all those elements bring us to a spiritual aspect. And I think that is one of the key, maybe the key aspect, which supports really everyday life in space and in the city. Sounds. I know that architecture is very visual discipline. It's almost all done by the eye. It's photographed, it's looked at. But I often think that that's not really the full story. That sounds. And perhaps because I was a musician professionally in my previous life, I know that orientation is really in the inner ear. Brussels has a sound. Mons has a sound. Spaces, this auditorium, which is beautiful, has its own special acoustics. despite this microphone. So sound is really an incredibly important sense of how a building is balanced and how a building appears. And when I had a chance to design and win the competition for the Performing Arts Center in Dublin, I thought that really it is about the sound of the city. This is not just any city, it's Dublin with its songs, with its Joycean language, which I wanted to create on this dockland, which was really an abandoned place. There was no life here. This was just the edge, the dangerous edge of the city. The street just behind it is called Misery Road. It's still the name of the street. It's Misery Road. So how do you bring life? How do you open this place and create something that is compact, that has a compact footprint, that is connected also to office complex, which I built around it, and which has very, very good acoustics. I have to say, I show this photograph because the man on the stage is not using a microphone, and you can hear, it's a 2,500 seat auditorium, which is for opera, for cabaret, for musicals. So it's a multi-purpose musical space. But again, the importance is really of the echo and the reverberation of sound. And of course, that has also to do with how the building is approached. I wanted to make it as open as possible until you reach the black box of the actual sound stage, and to create a kind of curtain which reveals on many levels the different facilities, the bars, the coffee. Well, there's a lot of beer drinking in Dublin. So that's an active space right behind that curtain. And of course, the building has a minimal footprint in order to be economical, to be built. And I think it has created a new life on this canal. There's new houses, there is new office spaces, new hotels. So this is becoming a shifting that weight from the developed center of Dublin to the periphery, which is a very beautiful, because of course the waterfront is such a key aspect of the history of Ireland and particularly of this city. Diversity is a word often used, but what does it mean when it comes to cities? How do you promote diversity? Sorry, there's too much light. If can be a little less light. But, diversity. How do you promote a diversity of in a plan, especially when you come to plan a large city, as I had a chance on a number of occasions? What does diversity mean in terms of each individual, and how do you plan a large scheme which has diversity? Now, I had occasion when I won the competition for the Yongsan Master Plan, which is a very large project connecting the mountains to the Han River, right in the center of the historical area of Seoul in Korea, one of the largest and most fantastic cities in Asia. How do you create that diversity when you are faced with a very, very large project? And I want to tell you that this project has more than 35 skyscrapers. But how do you create diversity for people who are human? How do you base it on human scale? How do you take something which is so abstract, like the grid, imposing a grid as if it was a kind of lifeless line that we have used for just too long, and really define it and articulate it by what is happening, by the great station, by the forces of nature, by creating an ecological and sustainable city? That's a very different aspect. And of course, to do that, what I have done is really created a plan which really is directed really more towards nature. It kind of breaks the plan into neighborhoods, creates green spaces in between, creates a kind of valley of retail, which is one of the largest retail developments in the world, not only in Asia, and creates really a space which is not only dramatic in height, because it will be dramatic since it has also the tallest tower in the world, but that is shaped so that it can be enjoyed culturally. Of course, there are residential spaces, there's housing, there is culture, there are many, it's a business park as well, it's the retail valley. It's an attraction that will redefine really the diversity of this great city of Korea. And of course, it's an area which has to work functionally at the river, but really bringing people to the river. This used to be, of course, the old military base, American military base, and the railway lines, and really to redefine it and create really the energy, the kind of entry port, because the main station, the new terminal, the new hub, the new water terminal as well, will really become one of the densest places. And of course, these are visualizations of that retail valley. So the word valley is not just a metaphor, it's really digging deep into the space in order to accommodate great density of program and creating a city that has really a diversity of activity, a diversity of architecture, a diversity of landscape, and a diversity of open public space that is dramatic not only from the distant view, and it will be, it's a kind of a crown, the crown of Shilla, the ancient really crown of Korea, but it is also really about reinforcing this really regenerative, diverse environment which is second to none in Asia or in the world. Now, I'm not an architect who's had projects that are very expensive. You know, many of my colleagues have projects that, you know, can use really very expensive materials, but I like the idea of raw. You know, sometimes you get a very small budget, and the idea is how do you build a building where you have very limited budget in a way which is not ostentatious but still provides an incredible space. How do you build a building with a very simple material where you reduce the details almost to zero and at the same time deliver this rawness in a way which is pleasurable, which is beautiful, which is interesting? So that's really a model, you know, of a building, by the way, of concrete. It's just concrete, built for an artist who has her studio and her showroom and her facilities in this place. And of course, it is a building that is molded in a very raw way. It is really, I would say, a demonstration of a kind of raw architecture. And this is not the only building like that. I've built many buildings that really don't need to have the complex materiality, but really continue to work. And what is a building? Well, a building is the light of the building, the proportions of the building, the materials of the building, how the building connects really the ground to the sky, and how it emerges in the everyday life. Dialogue, especially when it comes to places that have high density, is something I also believe is very, very important. How do you foster dialogue? How do you make people feel that there are others to talk to, especially in environments which are high density, not only in terms of just city, but even in a singular building? Now, I had a chance to win a competition in Hong Kong for the media center, which is really a large building, and at the same time, of course, the challenge here is to bring people together. There are thousands and thousands of students in Hong Kong, and the challenge was, you know, it's a government building. Government gives money really based on a cube of, you know, a cubic building. How do you create a building that speaks a language that expresses the dialogue within the building? Because we have artists in the building, we have media college, we have media school, we have a school of science, of mathematics. So science and art, animation, new technology. How do you bring that together and create really a lively environment which is interesting for the dialogue in the building? And you can see that this is a large scale building, very compact. It occupies a ground in a carved out mountain. But every element of the building, with its large sound stages, with its film spaces, has to really work in almost a mechanical way. And yet my concentration was to create a building that uses the public spaces, which are very, very limited, because there is no resources to create large public spaces, to connect people in a dialogical form, and to create really spaces that people can meet each other and talk to each other. This is not really a good photograph, but around this main stair, of course there are many elevators, are open spaces, and that's the way the building works. There are classrooms, people congregate, there are public discourses around, and you can, I think, get a sense of a building that really is a dialogue not only within itself, but also a dialogue between Hong Kong and the building. Because through the windows we have the spectacular, you know, from Kowloon, we see the harbor of Hong Kong, we see the energy of the city, and at the same time the building expresses that energy, expresses the spirit of entrepreneurship, artistic creativity, technology, in a building which is really, I think, a fun building to be in and go to school in. I've always believed that a building or a project should be unexpected. You know, architects are very often taught that the most important thing is the expected. But I think the unexpected, and what is unexpected in our time, is the fact that we don't have the clear line between culture and commerce anymore. It used to be, in the 19th, 20th century, there was a line dividing. On one side, you had culture, you had the elite, and on one side, you had commerce and the everyday life. And I think that line is increasingly eroded. It's blurred, and I believe that it's actually really kind of interesting and fantastic that that line is eroded, because when you design something like a gigantic shopping center, the issue is not so different from designing a museum. When I design a museum, my clients always ask me to make it commercially successful with its stores, cafes, restaurants, to make sure that it generates enough income to support itself. And the same is true for my commercial clients. They always say, well, Mr. Libeskind, you know, we know what a shopping center is, we know how to make money, but we want this building to have a cultural echo, to attract people not only in this old way, but really to come and be able. So again, this is a project which is very dramatic, it's very sustainable, it's on top of a highway, really on the main roads connecting Europe, connecting Austria, Germany, France, Switzerland, Italy, on that main road. And it's a mixed program that contains many different things, shopping, spas, housing for the elderly, convention centers, multiplex cinemas, and so on and so on. But you can perhaps see in these images that the interior has rather little to do with a shopping center. It is luminous, it is not in the dark, the circulation is broken down so that you have really vistas and places, and really, it really makes the consumer objects of capitalism look more like artworks, which are either needed or not needed, and creates really, I think, an attraction, because it is a very, very successful commercial center. Even in the time of economic decline, people come there because they enjoy the promenade through the building, they enjoy being there, and of course the building has almost sort of cathedrals of entertainment. This is a set of spas around water activities, which are also programmed in different ways. They're very high spaces, they're very dramatic spaces, and at night they turn into nightclubs. So they're programmed in different ways and very, very successful, of course, commercially. And that's one of the responsibilities when you create a building, that it's not just a building that is economical and profitable, but a building that contributes something to the life of this community. And of course, this building was in the kind of suburbs, but my idea was to concentrate this development so that it is really another city, which is really at the gateway of Bern. And of course, a complex that really has already resulted in many other denser buildings being built, rather than just building in the countryside, like the big Corbusian housing block, which stands by itself in this green landscape. So again, sustainability and the unexpected reprogramming of the image and effect of functions, I think, is very, very important. The word complex is usually not very attractive to architects. Everything in the 20th century was reduced to simplicity. The idea was that the world should be simple. But I have to tell you, the world is not simple. The brain is not simple. The DNA is not simple. The economic picture is not simple. Europe, the world, is not simple. So I was always interested in what is complexity? How does complexity play a role in architecture? And really, when I had a chance to design and win in the competition, the Imperial War Museum in Manchester, which is a museum about conflict, I really thought that the world is complex, that the world is shattered into pieces. It's not one world. It's a world that is in conflict with itself. And of course, the famous words of Winston Churchill, who said, it's a kind of a very wise statement, that there will always be a conflict in the world. There will never be a time without conflict. I thought about it because he was a great mind. And when I designed the Imperial War Museum here in Shards, at the water canal, ship canal, very similar to Dublin, destroyed area, really bombed out during the war, with a very dangerous area, very close to the Manchester United football grounds. This area has come back to life now. Because with this building, with the Lowry Center, with new shopping, new housing, the area has been regenerated. And you see the building in the shards, the earth shard, the water shard, the air shard, places which give a totally new sense of the complexity of where you are. And of course, you can go upwards and see the panorama of Manchester, which is so incredible. And within, it's not a regular museum, it's really a sound and light museum. This, on the earth shard, itself part of the globe, it's curved, but you don't really see it. It's very gradual, but you have to orient the public because it is really in darkness, and there are large-scale presentations here which tell the story of many, many things also ongoing with very simple technology. This is really with PowerPoint or slide projection, but somewhere in there are the emblematic instruments of war, and I think it's a very, very, very exciting place to be in. It's very popular with the public. It's not for people who like just weapons, because there are no weapons here, but really a place about the complexity of what is going on in the world, because we are in wars. English citizens are in the armies in Afghanistan, in Iraq, elsewhere in the world. So you can see the shard penetrating through the building. It's a metallic shard, and there is a temporary exhibition space. And I was struck, by the way, how much art in our time, in all time, is dealing with war. I was amazed that almost all art is also about conflict and about war, about violence. And I was reminded that even on the Parthenon, the most important pediment of the Parthenon, the most iconic building of the Western world, of Western Europe, is a depiction of the consequences of war and what is victory and what is loss. So again, this is an interesting aspect of complexity, because complexity is also in the urban form. What do you do on this ship canal? There is the Manchester United football grounds. There are some of the first buildings being built, the old warehouse. But you can see that the geometry, the complex geometry, and it is a complex geometry of this very, very really reduced building, is part of an idea of complexity. Counterpoint is something I've always been interested in. It's a personal interest, not only because I love Baroque music, but in Bach, the fugue, all the structures that I love are contrapuntal structures. And actually life, if you think that with every breath there is a counterpoint, that the life itself is a counterpoint to death, that we cannot escape from a contrapuntal, fugal, canonic life. That's the beauty, I think, of this concept. And when I had a chance to build a building in the city that I was almost born in, I was just born a few kilometers away in Warsaw, in Poland, where I come from, I thought of what a counterpoint is. Because when I was growing up, Poland was under communism, and this building, the Stalin Palace, it was given to oppress the Polish people. And as a Polish citizen, I understood what that building meant. It meant to diminish, to oppress, to kill the spirit of Poland. But when I had a chance to design a large, really the largest, the tallest residential tower in Europe, it's about 70 stories high, which is under construction, I thought the free wing of Poland, without the shadows of communism, a great society, a great culture coming back to life in the center of the city. And I think that is important, because to do that, of course, it's a commercial building, but it's not an extrusion. You don't have to do an extrusion. You don't have to do a box. You can't shape the building. Of course, it's difficult, and you have to struggle. But I wanted to shape the building to take advantage of its profiles, because it has to turn and give views and really frame in some way where it's located, and of course change the city, not only from the point of view that those lucky people who will live in this building, but people on the streets of Warsaw who are, of course, are in the central space. And it's a building that has, again, a level of complexity that is very, very specific to Warsaw. But all I want to say is that when this building is completed, I think even though it's only one building in the palace, some hotels are there, I think it will change the idea of what the center is about. It's no longer about oppressive symbolism, of domination, but it is about everyday life, about streets, about the beauty of the city of Warsaw. And this building will be finished very soon. I'm happy to go back to Warsaw and see it finished. The word urbane is something I often think about because, particularly in historical cities, it's not just urbanism or urbanity, but a certain sophisticated knowledge that citizens have of what happened in the past and what can happen in the future. And certainly when I was designing the project in Düsseldorf, I was really aware of the notion of the urbane, which is really a kind of poetic concept given the history of this very sophisticated city. On the Königsallee, you can see that this double site was the only site that was not built. We've got the Opera House, we've got the famous buildings from 19th century, 20th century. The one site of the 2 blocks remained unbuilt for historical reasons, and of course it completes Königsallee onto the park. So it's a very important building in terms of what it has to present to the park, very strictly controlled by planning agencies, but also how does it continue the street, and how does it also bring the urbane quality of a building to Düsseldorf. So in the model you can see it is a shape building that connects into many aspects of this site. Of course, the more formal aspect of the park, the piazza right behind it, and of course the streets around it. The building has large-scale cuts that bring the greenery through the building, and then on shadow plots it creates really a kind of more intimate space for people. So it's a building that has high level of retail, offices, but again a building that I think will, in a very, very positive way, create a kind of culmination, but also contextual continuity from Königsallee to the park. And of course, it is a very, very large and important project in terms of really raising that planning notion of Düsseldorf to its finality. Now, I've always been interested in expression. You know, I don't like coffee which is not espresso. And espresso means that it's not watered down coffee. It means that it's the essence of coffee. You get most coffee when you push down and you get the most. That's expression. And I think a building needs expression. I was never a fan of neutral buildings. You know, I'm not a neutral person anyway. I don't like neutrality. Because neutrality is a way of taking a position without taking a position. So expression is important, and I had a chance when I was designing a house for 2 art lovers who had a lot of art around them every day, who asked me to do a small house and said, you know, Mr. Libeskind, we would like to have a house, but we don't want any artworks in our house. We would like the house itself to be our artwork. And they're great experts in art, in Renaissance art, and Baroque art, contemporary art. So they're around art all the time. So I created a building, 1836-54. It's a geometric plan of a building that stands in Connecticut. It's a beautiful landscape, a very abstract form with very few. It's not a box. It's a continuous kind of folded space with very discrete openings, very private building, but a building that also gives an intimacy to the life in it's not a huge house. It's rather a small house, and of course takes advantage of where it stands, of the trees. It's clad completely in stainless steel. It's like a Ferrari from the outside, so it picks up the colors of the green, of blue. It doesn't have a permanent color really. And inside of the building, where I designed really, well, not as much as Joseph Hoffman, but a lot of things. A completely wooden interior, an oak. It's not a veneer, it's a solid oak building. So it has very different characteristics, externally and internally. And it's a building that moves inside and outside, that partly collapses into the landscape, partly raises itself, creates porches and places to enjoy the house and enjoy the vistas. And of course, has to function very, very well for my very, very sophisticated couple here. And of course, it's a small building, but nevertheless, a building that expresses also the client's love for certain things. And I'm very happy to say that the client loves the building. You know, you never know when you do a building. Sometimes people inherit a building or get a building that they don't really like. But I'm so happy that, that my clients enjoy the building, love being there. And again, it's about an expressive aspect of what a building can be and how it can continue to live its life. The word radical is not usually liked in architecture. It's okay for some lunatics on the streets with signs, but a radical, I really mean something that goes to the root of something. That's something radical. It's not something stupid. It's not just waving a flag. It's creating something that is rooted in a space. And when I had a chance to win the competition for the Royal Ontario Museum, I thought of, you know, the city needs something. Really, Toronto is a beautiful city where I lived. My wife comes from Toronto, but it was a very sleepy city. So you have to be radical. Wake the city up. The city has to awaken that it's, you know, it's a kind of little New York. It's not a sleepy English city anymore. It's a diverse city with fantastic young population. So yes, I created a connection. This is a historical structure. Buildings built in the 1920s, 1930s. But the main front of the building was just an empty facade built in the 70s, took it away, and that's, of course, the main avenue. It's like Fifth Avenue in front. The building had its back to it. So really, the Crystal opens a completely three-dimensional space for this really amazing museum, because this is a museum both of nature. The largest collections of dinosaurs, of nature, is in this museum, but it's also a museum of culture. The biggest Chinese collections, painting, art of the world is there. So it's like the Metropolitan Museum in New York and Natural History Museum in one mega building. And so the Crystal is kind of a showcase for really bringing people, particularly young people, to what was a very tired corner of a great city. And the building is metallic, you can see. And in the light of Toronto, I really wanted to create a different geometry so that the light on the building would always be different. Of course, the building does not have huge openings. It has some large vitrines where you can see the dinosaurs at night, but really to enliven the building and to create really a public space in front of the building. And this building is very popular with the public. It has many different spaces for different kinds of exhibitions and performances, because museums are changing. They are no longer just museums. And of course, it brings the historical fabric on the left. You can see from the 1930s, together with a new atrium, with a new entrance hall, really, and has some fantastic dinosaurs looking over the main streets of Toronto, which you can see. And you can compare the structure of the dinosaur to the structure of the Crystal. Kids love it. It's very popular. It has millions of visitors, the most popular museum in Canada. And I think it's something, again, that radically has changed Toronto. You know, sometimes you do a big plan, which doesn't do anything, but sometimes you can do a building where people are changed. The attitude to their city changes. And after this building, there are many, many really more radical buildings being built in Toronto. And Toronto is becoming a design city. Amazing. From a very, very sleepy, gray, neutral, nice, safe, good city to a city that has a kind of a buzz where young people, immigrants from around the world come and say, wow, we really want to be in this incredible society. The word transform is often used in architecture, but really, how do you transform something when you're an architect, when you have only a master plan? Or how can you aid in a positive transformation of a place? I had a good chance when I designed the master plan for the central neighborhood of city life, which is in the middle of Milan. This is where the expo, the Fiera, the fairgrounds, which used to have the furniture fair, all the different fairs, that has moved out to the suburbs. And this area in the middle of Milan, it's only 10 minutes away from the Duomo, it became available. There was a huge competition, many, many great architects entered. We were lucky to win, and I won also in the master plan, and working with two great architects. On the left, Zaha Hadid, the central tower is mine. On the right is Arata Isozaki. So it's really creating a green a park in the center of this area, creating some of the tallest skyscrapers, office building in the center, and in the periphery, really creating a new neighborhood of high-density housing. My tower itself is part of the concept of the master plan, that the central area of the piazza really shapes a kind of dome-like structure which is framed by the 3 skyscrapers. And of course, it has the subway stop, the Metropolitana stops there. It's really a hub of a vital neighborhood. And I worked very hard. How do you create high-density housing that isn't just a repetition of cubic blocks? And I'm happy that it's really under construction. It's really important in our time to figure out how to build everyday architecture for people. How does housing become iconic? Because in my view, we don't really judge cities by how good the museums are. We judge cities by how well do people live on the streets of a city. And I think that's really the aspiration, to create green spaces, a sustainable place, places that offer completely different kind of apartments, not the 18th and 19th century apartments, but apartments with light, which are interesting. And of course, I'm also doing a museum as part of the cultural development of this area, which is, as you can see here, a museum based on the architecture and the thought of one of the greatest architects of Milan, Leonardo da Vinci, who produced this amazing idea of the Vitruvian man in a circle and a square. But I think today, if he was working, it would be a man and a woman. It would be non-gender emblem, and it would also be oblique. And that's really the space of the museum. It's a space that I think will add to the mix of activities, which is living, which is playing. There's shopping centers. So it's really a mixed neighborhood. And you can see a little bit here in this rendering, Zaha's building on the right with the shopping center, my museum here, and the tower in the center, and Isuzaki's tall tower, which is going to be, again, one of the bigger commercial towers of the city. So again, I think it's important here that one understands that cities are changing, that cities are no longer just able to continue what they did before, because they will, if they don't compete, they will die. And it's no longer Italy versus Germany. It's now more Milan versus Frankfurt. It's no longer, France versus, England. It's more London versus Paris, Marseille, Lyon, Montpellier, and so on. So I believe that the energy of the city is very important in this context. A word that architects maybe don't like at all, political. But I think architecture is by definition political. What is the politeia? That's the citizens. That's what it means. An idiot means a private person. That's the definition of an idiot in Greek. And politeia means the civic space. So every building, even a small building, is in some way a political building because it's visible to others. And of course, that's an important aspect of architecture, particularly when it comes to very, very specific project. Now, in the project that I won in a competition for the German Military History Museum in Dresden, I had to struggle with this notion of the politics of showing a history of a military in Germany in a new European context. And what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, that I inherited a large arsenal, that U-shaped arsenal, which was built at the turn of the 19th century. It was always a military museum. By the way, the largest museum in Germany. It was a museum, a German museum, a Nazi museum, a Soviet museum, an East German museum. And of course, in 1989, after the unification, the question was, what do we do with this? When the project came up, I thought, it is not any longer possible to hide the military behind old walls. Just restore the arsenal. Military in a democracy is important. It has to be visible. It's our military. It's a military that is responsive to the votes of citizens. So the military has to penetrate through this, in a democracy, through this opacity of 19th century, 20th century catastrophes and emerge in the tip. And of course, the front tip of the building is a very, very dramatic space which culminates in the building. And you can see the restoration here of all the facilities of this grand arsenal. You can see it here from the air as it was still in construction. And what is it? This vector gives a view when you come to it at the end of your journey or at the beginning. It gives you a view of Dresden, a city that I saw resurrected even during the time I was building the building. When I started first, it was still a bombed-out city. And then Frauenkirche came up, and the building started appearing, a resurrection of a city that was devastated. So I oriented that building really to that view. But I also oriented the arrow itself towards the triangulated view from which Dresden was bombed in the bombings of 1945. So it's both. It's both a direction towards the resurrected city, but it's also a direction to the triangle. And the building is a self-similar triangle to that triangle from which the devastation of Dresden, and by the way, the devastation of cities from Dresden, Coventry, Wieliczka, all the cities that were bombed from Dresden also share that space. So here it is. It was a ruin really when I inherited this building. The East German government really ruined the incredible arsenal that was there. So I restored it. It's a horizontal building with a lot of history from the 13th century, military history of Germany. And then, of course, the building itself, interrupting the facade in a very peculiar point. It interrupts it kind of three-quarters way in the chronology between World War I and World War II. There is this interruption and that view, and a dramatic presence of the military, because this is the Museum of the Bundeswehr. This is belongs to the military. Actually, the second building where my clients were military. And by the way, I did like to work in Manchester with the military and here, because once they make up their mind, they don't waver. They go ahead, whatever the discussions are, they move ahead, and they are used to going forward. And of course, the spaces of the museum are themselves not just in the new part, very different. They are not column spaces. The space is three-dimensional. All the walls are leaning. The light is coming vertically, as you saw in the first picture. And the exhibits are very dramatic. For example, the helicopter here is not shown sort of standing like at an airport, but it's shown the way really we should see it, as destroying us, destroying itself. And what is this space about? This space is not about weapons. It's not about war. This vertical space is a question about what happens to people in wartime. Why do people participate in organized violence? Why do they fight in wars? What do they do? So I wouldn't say it's a peace museum, but it's a museum that poses fundamental questions, which really, I have to say, are very difficult questions that confront the viewer. And I'm very happy that this museum is very popular. It's built in a Baroque city. It's maybe the only building which is not Baroque or just a box behind an old facade, but people are interested to come to emerge into this vector, to view the city, to see that history, to see the open horizon, and also to remember the catastrophes that happen when people follow their leaders mindlessly, when people just follow orders and move into a catastrophic direction. Of course, that's what the building is about. It's a building about memory. It's a building about the city of Dresden, very specifically. It's about the history of Europe. And it's also about the new sense of where we are today. Well, the word unique is a favorite word, because how do you make something unique? Everything is the same. Our DNA is only, I think, 3% difference from the DNA of a chicken. But it's important 3%. So, yes, so how do we make something unique? And I think it's important, particularly when we talk about high-density projects, which tend to really repeat the same oppressive forms of high density. How do you create individuality in a building? Well, I had a chance to build a large project in Singapore, where I wanted to shape the buildings, the high-density project really of living. How do you shape buildings and create this is a very small piece of land on the bay, on the Keppel Bay, and the idea there is to create, it's a doubly curved structure. It's just a housing, it's just apartments, but each level is unique. It has a unique, it's not just above and below, it just has that slight tendency to individualize the place and give a different view. And of course, they're the lower 7 to 15 story sort of villa types that form the rest of the project. So again, I'm very interested in what do you do when you have such a small piece of land? You have incredible high density, maybe one of the highest densities in the world, and yet create an environment which is beautiful, where people really want to live, where people can enjoy nature, where they can enjoy the waterfront, where they can have, bring the pleasures of the boardwalk and the nature, the tropical nature of a place like Singapore. So even the clubhouses, the swimming areas, the little pavilions are part of very ambitious project, and of course, to create the green crowns, which are just in the process of growing, and to create the bridge connections, which also are kind of parks on upper levels, to give people more green space, and at the end, of course, to create really a new gateway. It's a residential. It's not a museum, not a public building, but a kind of a new gateway that shows that really it's about life in Singapore. It's not about just symbols of the government, but it's about how well people live. And I'm saying people in Singapore live pretty well, given that it's a small city-state. Okay, a word that is very controversial when it comes to anything in life. We are very averse to risk. Nobody wants to take a risk. But you know, life is a risk. Every moment is a risk. Every breath is a risk. What would life be if we did not realize that there is a risk? So I think that's true also for architecture, that architecture cannot just sort of find its comfort area and just sort of slide along, that it has to share in a risk, because the cities are at risk as well, and buildings contribute to the stability of cities. So when I had a chance to build the Denver Art Museum, I thought, this incredible city in the Rocky Mountains, I mean, we have to take a risk. The city was considered a cow town, a town for cows. You know, it was, backward, but it's not backward, it's beautiful. It's a fantastic pioneering city. So yes, I designed a building that really is risky in many ways, because it brings the exhibits into a diagonal position, sort of flowing over the skyline of the city. It's got many, many different aspects of space, and it gives you that kind of vertigo that you get when you go to the Rocky Mountains. And people in Denver are very open-minded, they're very healthy, they like sports. So the adventure of a building is part of course, the risk, and the risk is well taken because people enjoy art in new installations. They enjoy, of course, there are some very conventional spaces here too. There are some really rectilinear spaces, very few, I would say, just for Western art. But most of the spaces, oceanic art, African art, modern art, they were not born in a cube, and they don't belong in a cube. So my clients here were very, very clear that they wanted to create a spatial whole that was also urban. And I have to say, I was very lucky to be able to build a building, and even more than a building, because I suggested that they should create a piazza. This was beyond the building competition. And I was also lucky to be able to create a piazza and build a housing that frames the piazza. So again, with a beautiful golden state capitol, this building has really redefined this area of town, which used to be just parking lots when I first came there. There was nothing but just parking, and nobody really lived there. It was kind of black hole in the middle of town, but now high density, artists move. There's a new museum that was built there, new galleries, the art scene. So again, downtown is resurrected, and that was part of the risk, which the developers took to build housing in this area, which the museum took to create a design which is very bold, connected, of course, across the street to the Gio Ponti buildings built in the 70s. Well, this is my last word, so you don't have to wait too much longer for the end. But I am truly a believer that architecture can really be only done in a democratic spirit. Without democracy, I don't really care about how beautiful the building is, how big it is. I don't care for impressive buildings by kings or dictators or autocrats or totalitarian minds. They don't impress me. What impresses me is buildings done in a democratic, difficult navigation of different interests in a free society. And I believe that that is a key component of architecture in our time. Democracy isn't just using a lot of glass in a building. Democracy is the context of working with many, many different groups, to gather a consensus. Now, very often, I'm asked, of course, as a master planner of Ground Zero, where was I on September 11th, 2001? And everybody assumes I was in New York, but I was not. After 13 years of living in Berlin and building the Jewish Museum, which was not easy because it was a political, highly difficult building to build, to take so much time. The building actually opened for the first time its doors in the morning of September 11, 2001. That's when the building officially opened to the public. And I remember going to my studio that day and saying, you know, how wonderful. This is the first day I don't really have to think about history, Jewish history in Germany, because people can now enter the museum and see it for themselves, make their own experience. And then, of course, in the afternoon, by 2:30, 2:45 Berlin time, the museum closed its doors. It was uncertain. After the attacks in New York, the museum closed its doors, and the museum remained closed for 3 days. And I thought, you know, nothing in history is over. Everything in history keeps moving on. And it's not, history is not just a story with a good ending or a bad ending, because it depends on what we do in that story. So it's always a story that has a tension in it and that requires our own commitments. And so when I was lucky to win the competition to design the master plan of Ground Zero Memory Foundation, what did I do? There were 500 architects in the competition. And at the end, there were 7 architects. But I have to tell you what I did, which was different. I decided not to build on half of the site. You know, it's a small site, 16 acres in the lower Manhattan. It's not a large site, 16 acres. When you consider 10 million square feet of office buildings are required, 5 million square feet of cultural buildings, infrastructure, and so on, of course, everybody mostly put buildings in the center again. But I thought, no, this is not possible. It is not really a piece of real estate anymore, because this is where people perished. So this is now a public space of memory, which should be really carved into New York in a deep way, and of course, should be used to create an incredible city that has the vitality, the optimism, and the vibrations of New York City. So yes, that's what Memory Foundation was about. And of course, to create the plan, I concentrated on many aspects. First of all, I didn't propose one big tower or 2 big towers like many architects in the center. I proposed to distribute the towers into 5 towers. Freedom Tower, Tower number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, decreasing in height from the symbolic height of 1776, the Declaration of Independence, after all, a document of freedom of thinking and human rights, first one in the world, descending down in the kind of emblematic form of the Torch of Liberty, just to the south, and to leave the central area as a public space. You know, this is a dense area. This is Wall Street, but it's not only Wall Street. It's Tribeca, it's Chinatown, it's Battery Park City. It's many neighborhoods which have to come together, and I wanted to really create a neighborhood, and not only a neighborhood, but also a depth of the site that really touched that sacred soil. So here you can see my first sketch, really, from the competition, and the last rendering. You can see that it's pretty close, given, of course, that you have to garner consensus. There are so many stakeholders, families of the victims, the Port Authority, a gigantic organization run by the governor of New York and governor of New Jersey, who owns the land and leases it to architects and to investors and their architects. We have, of course, the city of New York, with the mayor of New York in charge of the streets of New York. We have the PATH terminal trains running under. We have the subways. So it's really a world that has to be organized. But I thought, yes, it should be emblematic. It should be beautiful. It should reaffirm what New York is really all about and what this event really meant for New York. I just show you this very briefly because there's a whole world underneath of subways, of infrastructure. And in my plan, of course, you have to really build the infrastructure and the foundations before all the buildings are built, because they're not built at one time. And that's, of course, the complexity of this amazing space. I also wanted very much to maintain openly that wall that we all saw during the catastrophe of the attack, the slurry wall, which, you know, when I went down to the base, to the bedrock of New York, I really felt I was in touch with those who are no longer here. You can feel it. And I wanted to leave that space as it was, with this huge dam. This wall is a gigantic dam. It's 75 feet high. It moves throughout the whole site. If this wall had collapsed during the attack, all the waters of the Hudson River, which are just on the other side, would have flooded the underground, the New York subway system and the path. So it's an amazing wall, which I thought, yes, people should be able to see it. And it is, of course, now incorporated into the museum. It will be a very dramatic. The museum will open probably next year. I was at the opening just last September 11th with the President of the United States, with the mayor, with the governor, and most importantly with the families, who I have to say touched me deeply, because many hundreds of people came over to me, families of firemen, of policemen, people who perished, who said, you know, Mr. Libeskind, you didn't just tell us what you would do, you actually delivered. And it's very important to deliver what you promise, because especially in a place like New York, you know, there's so much conflict, so much tension, that to deliver a project means to navigate through democracy and achieve something that is worthwhile. And of course, when the buildings are finished, and we have tower number 1, the Freedom Tower, is almost topped out. Tower number 4 is almost topped out. Tower number 3 is highly visible. The memorial, which is beautiful with the waterfalls, which I also proposed to screen the sound of busy streets with the names of people, is opened. The museum will open soon. And the PATH terminal is under construction. So in a few years, it takes time. It's not really that fast to build it, but I think this will become the prime public space in New York. And I have to tell you, I always thought, you know, I didn't come from a wealthy family. My parents were immigrants to New York. I was an immigrant to New York. And my parents worked in factories, in sweatshops of New York. And I always thought, you know, what is it for New Yorkers? It's not just the gleaming buildings where most New Yorkers will never be. They will not even be in the lobbies of those buildings. Where will the New Yorkers be? They'll be on the streets of New York, in the parks of New York, on the Hudson River. That's really what New York is really about. And that's where I started. I started with a Statue of Liberty. I started with that notion that it is to welcome the immigrants, the strangers, and everybody in New York almost today. 4 out of 10 people are immigrants from some other part of the world. And that's what New York is about. It's an affirmation of life, affirmation of liberty, affirmation of democracy. And no one said democracy is easy. Democracy is tough, but that's what I believe in. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.